Hello and welcome to this Unit 4 video lecture. In this unit, we will be exploring two of the more prominent poleis, Sparta and Athens, and take a look at the development of each. And we should note that these two poleis will alternate between being allies when their interests align and adversaries when they feel as if one is intruding on the sphere of influence of the other. Indeed, Athens and Sparta come into frequent conflict with each other, sometimes to the point of open warfare, particularly as the 5th century BCE progressed. We will examine the Spartans first in this lecture and follow up with a look at the development of Athens in subsequent lectures. I should point out that the reason Sparta and Athens are singled out for special treatment is in part because of the vast territory each will control. You will see here that Sparta is located on the peninsula called the Peloponnese or Peloponnesus, and Sparta, through the course of much of its history, will wind up controlling a huge portion of this peninsula, which, as you can see, is a very large landmass. The Athenians will inhabit the Attic Peninsula, with the city of Athens located near the western coast. So both of these poleis will have significant resources in population and land, and that will make them the most powerful of all the Greek poleis. Now, Sparta is a difficult place to study because of how ancient writers, especially the Athenians Xenophon and Plato, pictured the Spartans. And you have to remember, these authors are our primary sources. So these authors actually admired Sparta for its good order and government by proper law. These same authors, despite being Athenians themselves, despaired of Athens as a radical democracy, always dangerously close to veering out of control. They believed that Sparta's constitution should serve as a model for other states, and they idealized Sparta as an unchanging world in which the institutions of government could be traced to their founding via the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who, if he did live at all, is believed to have lived around the 8th century BCE. So, to outsiders and fans of oligarchy, the Spartans had an organized society in which everyone was equal and adhered to the laws. And now, as a result of this image, the term Spartan mirage is often applied to this perception of Sparta as a utopia. Indeed, the reality was much different, as we'll see, than this mirage that was presented. And the Spartans might have lived in a structured society, but beneath the veneer of orderliness and obedience, Sparta was just as chaotic as any other polis, and quite a bit more brutal. So we'll begin to deconstruct the mirage by looking at the early history of Sparta, and we'll take a look at some of the characteristics of its culture, its government, and why the Spartans took a turn toward extreme militarism as a means of organizing their society. So the Spartans were believed to be descended from a group of people called the Dorians, who inhabited the northern fringe of Greece. And when the collapse of Mycenaean civilization occurred, these Dorians migrated southward into the Peloponnese sometime in the 11th century BCE. The original inhabitants of the Mycenaean palaces are believed to have migrated eastward and moving into Attica and then beyond into that area the Greeks called Ionia, located on what is today the western coastal region of Turkey. We see a grand reshuffling of Greek populations, with the Dorians holding much of the Peloponnese. So Sparta began as a collection of essentially 5 villages in the Eurotas Valley in the region known as Laconia or Lacedaemonia. Once these villages had united in what was known as a synoikism, a gathering together, they seem to have been governed by a single monarch, but sometime in the later Dark Age, the reign of a single king ended and was replaced with two kings, a form of government known as diarchy. Now, this unusual form of government, having two kings, was probably part of the unification process, and we see that it is likely that this was meant to placate the second most powerful family living in those original 5 villages. So a type of political compromise that would be long enduring in Spartan history. And again, from this point on, the Spartans retained 2 royal dynasties. The senior line was known as the Agiad line, and the junior line was known as the Eurypontid line from these family names. So these Spartan kings were hereditary military commanders, and they also had a priestly function, but they were far from absolute. They ruled more by influence than by dictate. Now, because Sparta lies in a valley flanked by mountains, it is easily defended from approach by land, and as you can see, it is well inland, so it's not vulnerable to attack by the sea. So the Spartans did have time to get themselves together without fear of foreign invasion. And the Spartans will, over time, take control of much of the Peloponnese, and that is because while many of the Greek poleis throughout Greece during the Archaic period will choose overseas colonization as a means of dealing with population pressures, the Spartans, once they begin to expand beyond what the resources of the Eurotas Valley will sufficiently feed, the Spartans will decide that we're not going to go overseas. Instead, we're going to invade our neighbors to the west on the Peloponnese and take control of their territory and basically subject these fellow Greeks, these Messenians as they were called, to a type of servitude status, forcing these people who were, again, their fellow Greeks, basically to become Spartan serfs. And the Spartans will actually coin a term for these enserfed people, calling them helots. Now, these Messenians will not go peacefully into bondage, and there will be some very significant revolts that will very much test the Spartan ability to control a vast hostile population. But by the 650s, it is believed that the Spartans have more or less conquered Messenia and have indeed forced the native population, the Messenians, into servitude. And once the Messenians have become helots, serfs of the Spartans, the constant tension between the Spartans and their Messenian helots is going to force Sparta to embark on a process of extreme militarization that will forever define the Spartans in the historical imagination. This militarization process and the political transformation that occurred with it is credited to, again, the perhaps mythical lawgiver Lycurgus. Now, modern historians disagree over whether Lycurgus ever actually lived or not, but he was revered as the founding father of the Spartan polis, providing the Spartans with this well-governed state. And in the well-governed state, you're not necessarily concerned with people's rights or freedoms. Everybody is just expected to do their duty to the state. In ancient Sparta, doing your duty began at birth. Indeed, some of you are probably familiar enough with some of the more extreme stories related to ancient Sparta, and you may have heard, for example, that newborns were examined shortly after birth to determine physically if they were strong enough to endure the rigors of Spartan society. and those newborns who were considered weak were left outdoors to die. Now, infant exposure, as this practice was called, was not unique to Sparta. Other Greek poleis practiced it, but it was usually a decision made by the parents, not necessarily a decision made by the state. And that really does set Sparta apart from the other Greek poleis. Because in Sparta, you would have the tribal elders visit your home and examine the baby, and it was the decision of that Spartan official or officials whether the child would live or die. And if the baby was allowed to live, infant girls and boys would live at home with mom, but when the boy reached the age of 7, Spartan officials would take him from his mother with mom's full consent, and the child would then begin a process of military training. This process began at age 7 and continued until the young man turned 20. And these 13 years, from the ages 7 to 20, were marked by a constant regimen of brutal physical and psychological training. Now, Spartan men were allowed to marry when they were in their 20s, but they had to visit their wives in secret. They were not allowed to move into their own homes until they were 30. And the age of 30 is somewhat of a benchmark for Spartan males, because it was at the age of 30 that if the warrior had performed well enough, he would be voted into one of what were called Syssidion. These are mess units or barracks units where a group of warriors would be billeted together. They would eat together, they would sleep in the same barracks, and if the warrior had performed well enough, he would be voted in by his peers. He would then become known as a homoioi, or equal. In other words, a full Spartiate. He received a land allotment, which was called a kleros, which was farmed by a family or families of helots. And this land allotment had to support this Spartan warrior and his family, and it would provide the Spartiates, this Spartan warrior who was now voted in, it would provide him with the resources necessary for him to contribute regularly to his Syssidion, his mess unit. And whatever produce was left would go to the helot workers and their families. So this land allotment, this kleros, and the resources that were derived from the kleros or kleroi, they become a key status marker for these Spartan warriors. If something should happen and that land allotment could not produce the resources necessary for the Spartan to pay his regular dues, then he could lose his full Spartiate status. He could be demoted to a lesser status. Indeed, it was not unusual for Spartans to undergo decades of this brutal training, only to be denied the status of homoioi because of some perceived flaw or failure to pay the mess dues. And we might imagine that this was a shattering rejection, but from the Spartan perspective, it was absolutely necessary that only the best would be made full Spartan warriors, or homoioi, and that is because of the constant fear of a helot revolt. It was believed that every Spartan warrior had to be worth 10 of the helots. So there was no compromise on warrior quality in the eyes of the Spartans. Indeed, even though the last major revolt of the helots, which was called the Second Messenian War, was crushed in the mid-7th century BCE, the Spartans were ever mindful that there could be future revolts, as the plight of the helots would never improve, and revolution would be their only means of achieving their freedom. So the helots were a constant threat, and in a way, the Spartans are enslaved by the helots because they live in constant fear of a rebellion. And they've organized themselves in such an extreme militaristic lifestyle that there was very little room for any type of freedom or any type of cultural opportunity other than to train to be a warrior. Indeed, it's important to recognize that during the early Archaic period, that is, before the Spartans fully mobilized against the Messenians and began the conquest of the Messenians, the Spartans themselves had produced fine pottery, furniture, poetry, and crafted some very eloquent poetry. Now, all of this stopped when the Spartans turned towards militarism, and they excluded all luxury goods and creature comforts. So the Spartans made this choice, and they will certainly live by this code, this Lycurgan constitution, for centuries. And it certainly will differentiate the Spartans from all the other Greeks. And it will give the Spartans a notorious reputation for military efficiency, but also for brutality. And the brutality comes into play as one of the final initiations that were undertaken by young Spartan men who were finishing up their years-long boot camp, the agoge as it's called. These young Spartan males, if they performed exceptionally well, would be enlisted into a type of secret police force called the Crypteia. And it was the role of the Crypteia to instill constant fear into the helots, keeping the helots off balance and unable to organize any type of serious revolt. And what would happen is that these young Spartan males who were enlisted into the Crypteia would be given a dagger, a knife, and would be told to go out at night and roam the countryside looking for any helots who were out and about. The helots were under a curfew where they had to remain in their homes once the sun went down, and the Spartans did not want any kind of gathering of helots or any communication between the helots. So the curfew was, as we'll see, strictly enforced. So to discourage communication among the helots, these young assassins would roam the countryside and murder any helot found outside of his house during the nighttime hours. So again, there is this aspect of totalitarianism and brutality that is part of Spartan society, and it certainly does get overlooked in more popular treatments of the Spartans, such as the movie 300, which was released back in 2006. Now, this movie, granted it was based on a graphic novel, with some aspects of the screenplay taken directly out of the Herodotus history. But this movie, it certainly showed the brutality of the agoge training system, the boot camp system, but it really did not highlight the servitude, the bondage, and the brutality that the helot population was forced to endure. So that movie, 300, continues to perpetuate this Spartan mirage. Now, ironically, although Sparta was a very structured society, Spartan women were known to have more freedom than women in any other Greek polis. This makes sense when you consider that Spartan males were often away either on campaign or on some sort of military duty, or even during times of peace. Spartan males spent most of their time with their messmates in the barracks. And so Spartan women were often on their own in managing the household. And Sparta was one of the few places in ancient Greece where women could actually own land. Indeed, in the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Aristotle mentions that in the Spartan region of Laconia, 2/5 of the land was owned by women. And although girls stayed home after age 7 and were looked after by their mothers, they still continued with physical training to make them strong and healthy. The idea being that strong, healthy women will give birth to strong, healthy children, particularly sons, And women were encouraged to have as many children as possible, particularly sons. And it was expected that women would be every bit as physically fit as males. While boys were readied for a life on military campaign, girls practiced dance, gymnastics, and javelin and discus throwing, which were thought to make them physically strong for motherhood. And it is said that Spartan males would be honored after death if they were killed in battle, and that Spartan women, if they died during childbirth, would have their names carved into a type of monument to commemorate their sacrifice for the state. And that is what having children was considered. It was a service to the state. Now, these Spartan women were adamant supporters of Sparta's militarism. Indeed, various ancient commentators have noted the psychological toughness of Spartan wives and mothers. The first century Greek historian, Plutarch, compiled the quote-unquote sayings of the Spartan women, a collection of admonishments by Spartan women urging their men to be successful on the battlefield or die trying. And some of you may be familiar with this gem here, which again captures the essence of what these Spartan women's sayings were all about.
Come back with your shield. Or on it.
Yes, my lady.
And as we begin our transition towards a closer examination of Spartan government, I just want to point out that in the components of Spartan society, we've already looked at the homoioi, the full Spartiates, and we've looked at the helots. Well, I should point out that there was an intermediate group that did not enjoy the full rights and privileges of full Spartan citizens, but they were not kept in a condition of forced servitude as the helots were. This intermediate group, they were known as the perioikoi, translated as the dwellers around. And this was a population made up of people who had been likely early on when the Spartan synoikism, the unification of those original 5 villages, when that synoikism took place, they may have been a neighboring population who the Spartans early on realized could prove useful. And the Spartans decided to give them limited rights and freedoms in return for their capabilities as craftspeople. These perioikoi could be, if the need arose, enlisted into the Spartan military ranks, and they would be able to fight alongside the Spartans. But their primary role was as freehold farmers and craftspeople. The Spartans themselves did not practice agriculture, as we've seen. They left that to the helots, nor did they practice commerce or any type of craft or industry. And for a military society in the ancient world, there was a requirement for someone to create weapons and shields and armor and all that stuff. And this role was filled by these perioikoi. So the 3 broad categories of Spartan society were at the top, again, the homoioi, the full Spartiates. The perioikoi are the intermediate group. And at the very bottom were the helots. So given this social structure, let's now take a look at institutions of Spartan government. So let me begin by saying that the Spartans historically have been praised for the stability of their constitution, and historical commentators have noted that the Spartans created one of the earliest examples of what is called a mixed or balanced constitution, because it contains elements of the 3 main types of political system. With Sparta's 2 kings, you have a monarchical or executive component. You have an oligarchic component representing the aristocracy, and you have a democratic component representing the popular masses, all merging together in a complex political balance based on a system of checks and balances. I hope that sounds familiar. Indeed, the power of the kings was far from absolute. Kings were actually in a type of subordinate position to a group of 5 officials called ephors, who had an oversight role and could impeach the kings for various offenses. The ephors also controlled Sparta's foreign policy. So the 2 kings are actually restricted in what they can do in crafting domestic and foreign policy, and they have a very limited role, primarily overseeing various religious rituals in Sparta, and whenever necessary, one king was allowed to lead the army on military campaigns, while the other king would stay back in Sparta. So we have the 2 kings and the 5 ephors, and the Spartans instituted a type of bicameral legislature made up of a higher council, which was called the Gerousia, which is a 30-member council made up of the 2 kings and 28 men who are over the age of 60 years old. These 28 were chosen by the popular assembly, which was made up of all Spartan homoioi, that is, the full Spartiate citizens. The Gerousia was responsible for initiating legislation which was voted on in an up or down yes or no vote by the popular assembly. Now, the Gerousia also retained the right of veto, so it also had the power to veto any law that they did not believe should move forward, even if it had been voted by the General Assembly, or the Appella as it was called, which was, again, open to all full Spartan citizens. So we see this kind of checks and balances built into the Spartan political system. And on the surface, Sparta looks like a model polis, orderly, well-governed, and stable, very stable. As we will see, though, beneath the surface mirage, the reality was quite a bit different, and political infighting could be a real problem for the Spartans. But there can be no denying that the Spartan model of emphasizing military supremacy above all other concerns was effective for some time. One indication of the effectiveness of this model was the development of the organization that was destined to become Sparta's empire, the Peloponnesian League. And as we have seen, Sparta had been gradually increasing its power in the Peloponnese by conquering its neighbors, but had been held somewhat in check by Argos, located here. Indeed, the feud between Sparta and Argos was one of those legendary rivalries that goes back centuries, as each competed to be the dominant power in the Peloponnese. Well, in 546 BCE, the Spartans were able, finally, to defeat the Argives, and building on the momentum of this victory, Sparta began to create a series of alliances with other Peloponnesian states, which ultimately resulted in the creation of what modern historians call the Peloponnesian League. In the Peloponnesian League, the Spartan allies swore an oath to support each other in times of war and to follow the lead of the Spartans. So with the creation of the Peloponnesian League, the Spartans are able to weave together the strands of foreign and domestic policy. Indeed, the League would prove crucial to helping the Spartans assert themselves in Greece, while also helping the Spartans crush any Helot revolt that might arise. So with the power of Sparta increasing, we will now turn our attention to the polis destined to be Sparta's great rival, the evolving democracy of Athens.